Hi, this is Mike Livermore, and with me today is John Cannon, Professor of Law Emeritus at the University of Virginia. John has a long and distinguished career as a law scholar and practitioner. He served as EPA's general counsel during the Clinton administration, where he authored the famous Cannon Memo that laid out the case for the agency's authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act. This memo was cited in Massachusetts v. EPA, and this is a legal question that remains at the heart of current climate change policy in the U.S. John's current book project takes a step back from the daily grind of environmental law and politics to reflect on the role of place in our lives and in structuring our relationships to the natural world. I've been fortunate to have read some of the draft chapters, and it's a wonderful exploration of these questions. I'm looking forward to chatting about them today. John, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Mike. It's great to be with you this morning.
So, maybe just to get us started, how did you come to this idea of place? Like what is the idea of place? I know what a place is generally, but I think there's more to the concept than maybe in our common way of talking. And so what is this concept, and how did you come to it?
Well, I think I've been coming to it all my adult life, and perhaps before that. I think naturally and instinctively we relate to places that we are, places that we live, places that we call home. And I think we do that from early childhood on, mostly in a pretty unconscious way. But when I sort of became aware of my environmental proclivities, I began to think about the places that I'd been and my experiences there and what that meant for me going forward in terms of my views and attitudes and feelings about the environment. So I think that basic concept has been percolating for a long time. I will tell you, in my service at EPA, I was struck both by the importance of the agency's work, but also by the level of abstraction at which that work moved forward. So when we adopted air quality standards, they were national air quality standards. When we adopted standards for cleanup of Superfund sites, they were standards that were intended to be uniform to create standard levels of tolerable risk and so forth at sites around the country. They didn't, at least on their face, in many cases, acknowledge the unique qualities of different places or the feelings and preferences of the people actually living in those places. And I totally committed to the project of environmental regulation, but also felt that there was something missing in the presentation, if not the formulation, of these rules. And for a time at EPA, I pushed this notion of place-based environmental protection, which was to appeal more directly to the concerns and aspirations of people in particular places when we were talking about regulations that were national in effect but had a particular impact. And for a while, the administrator was talking about protecting real people in real places as a way of expressing that connection. But I think the tension is there, and it continues today.
That puts me in mind of a passage that I really like from Bill Ruckelshaus. Did you ever interact with Bill Ruckelshaus?
Oh, yes, I did. Yeah. I actually was an associate in the law firm that he started before I went to EPA, and then I interacted with him since then.
For folks who are unfamiliar, this is kind of one of the great figures in U.S. environmental law and policy over the last several decades. EPA administrator twice during Republican administrations, but also widely beloved within the environmental community. The passage that I'm thinking of is I actually assign it for one of my classes, which is part of why I remember it. It goes, environmentalism at its inception was a grand vision, one that nearly all Americans willingly shared. Somehow that vision of the essential unity of nature and of the need to bring industrial society into harmony with it has been lost among the parts per billion, and with it we have lost the capacity to reach social consensus on environmental policy. So that sounds kind of similar to the sentiment that you were describing.
Yes, that is certainly part of it. And the other part of it is that, environmentalism as a general concept and connection with nature as a general concept are fine, but those all have their expression at least in my experience, in particular places, and actually through individual or community experience.
So part of what so I think maybe there are like two ways or two, kind of ways into this idea of place as it relates to this question of, kind of how we think about environmental policy at a very high level. So one is as a way of communicating. And I can imagine, a PR conversation or a conversation with communications people that goes along the lines of, look, we can't talk about parts per billion. Nobody knows what that is. We can't talk about the value of statistical life. That sounds crazy. We need to bring in the kids that are getting asthma, or we need to bring in the moms, or we need to bring in the doctors or whatever, just as a way of, the way any good journalist, right, frames a story, even if it's about something very abstract, like, education policy, right? The lead is about some kid or some parents or whatever, right? So as a way of kind of humanizing these seemingly abstract policy questions. So that's kind of one angle to this. But it seems like there's something else too, which is, well, I don't know. So is that the whole story, or is there more to this concept that is deeper in the sense that it tells us, I don't know, how we should be thinking about environmental policy, or how we should be thinking about our relationship to the natural world? And if we think in this purely abstract way, that will lead us astray somehow.
I think so. I think the communications are an important part of it, and that's sort of when I was speaking earlier about place-based environmental protection. That was the thrust of that. But there is, I think, at least in my perception, something deeper going on here. So the whole structure of environmental law, which is very complicated, and the creation of environmental policy, which can get quite analytical or technical, presume certain dispositions or inclinations on the part of people, certain values that we're trying to protect through collective action. And where do those values come from? How do they get shaped? And my own sense of this is that those values and the worldviews that they are part of get shaped through our experience in particular places at particular times as we grow up and mature, as we go to work, as we seek recreational activities and otherwise live our lives. So there's a sense I have that that formative experiences within particular places, I mean, our experiences all take place within a place, right? That these formative experiences, both individually and collectively, have something significant to do with place and the places where they occur. And when I talk about place, I'm not just talking about the biophysical place. I'm talking about the social and economic elements of place too. And in my concept, all those things go together and are interacting all the time.
So, tell me if this sounds wrong, but economists will sometimes talk about preferences.
Right, yeah.
Right? And, one way of thinking about environmental law and policy is, well, people have preferences for, environmental amenities, clean air, clean water,
Right.
Nice vistas, open spaces, or whatever, and that what we're doing in environmental law is protecting these amenities because people care about them, because people value them.
Right.
And typically economists don't inquire into how people come to those preferences. Why do people like the things they do? Economists again, or the economic perspective just takes as a given that people like certain things. And then, normatively, we might go about the project of maximizing the things that people like and want. And perhaps the place-based perspective or the place perspective that you're discussing is inquiring into how do we come to value the things that we value, want the things that we want, dislike or be averse to things that we don't like.
That's exactly correct. I mean, the idea is that who knows where preferences come from? They come from all sorts of places. But in my experience, my interaction with natural environments and social environments leads to the formation of certain likes and dislikes, certain attractions and not attractions.
Aversions. Yeah.
Aversions. And, if I were an economist, I'd try to capture my senses along those lines with the senses of other people and aggregate them and come to some cost-benefit calculation. But the origins of those preferences seem to me to be bedded in experience, and that experience takes place in a place,
right,
or many places over time. I mean, and modern people don't live in one place. And our experiences are really an aggregate of experiences that we have in many different places. But those experiences, I think, are foundational to how we value the world and what we want from it going forward.
There's so many fun ways to take this conversation, but maybe one. What I think is a hard question. This might not be such a hard question for you. You provide. You let me know. But so one idea here is that the project, or thinking about place in this way of trying to come to understand how people value the things that they value and so on, is as a descriptive project. It's a process. It's a social, cultural, psychological process that we're interested in as scientists or as humanists or just scholars interested in how the world works. And then there's another way of thinking about it, which is that there's a normative component to it, that there are some things that we ought to value, there are some things that we ought to be averse to, and it's important to understand how people really come to their values, because then we can start to think in sophisticated ways about how to structure the world or structure people's experience such that they come to value the things that they ought to value. And I'm curious which of these two broad frameworks kind of better describes your interest in these questions.
Well, I think it's both. I think the descriptive component is important, at least in the thing I'm working on now. But there's, I think, inevitably a normative component. That is, I see value in places, in certain dimensions of places that I think is important, and my aspiration is that other people will think they're important too. And that's not necessarily the case. I mean, I live in the country. There's a large tract of land next to me that was until recently forested, and I loved the woods, and I walked through the woods with the permission of my neighbor, and it was beautiful, and I got a lot of benefit from that. And then my neighbor decided that he wanted to create pasture land for cattle, and he cut down all the woods, and that was his prerogative. But that was something, as a normative matter, I objected to, and probably as a matter of purely personal interest. And he had another idea in mind as to the value of that landscape for certain enterprises that he wanted to undertake. So that's that's an example of a normative conflict at a very local, personal level, and those take place all the time. I think it's I don't think the normative, at least in this setting, I don't think the normative project is one of advocacy in a direct way. I think it's more a matter of modeling or showing people how one comes or might come to a deeper appreciation, for example, of the value of forested land. And that's why I, at least for the purpose of this book, I'm taking a less discursive and more narrative approach.
It's a great example, and so I'm inclined to kind of push on it to see if we can if it's illuminating. So on the one hand, we might think, look, there's just some finite resources in the world, and we need to decide what to do with them, and we might have just conflicting wants and desires. And there's a cake. I want some of the cake. You want some of the cake. Everybody else wants some of the cake, and and that's just the way it is, right? And under that view, right, and maybe interjecting a little bit of this kind of notion of place into that, you come to a way of relating to this land by walking there and through your own experiences with forests and the value that you get out of interacting with a place when it has certain characteristics. And then this fellow has a different set of experiences with different places, and who knows? Let's just make it up and say he lived out in the West, and he's familiar with these pasture lands and cattle, and that's a place-based understanding of the world, right? And an understanding of the value of place that's in part commercial. That you get some commercial value by. But it's productive, right? The thinking of land being put to a productive use, which comes out of an experience of place, is part of his worldview. And so what you have here is a conflict over a finite resource, a chunk of land, and two different ideas about how to put it to its best use. And so I guess to really put a fine point on it would be the distinction on the one hand that this is just, again, a finite resource, two different conflicting ideas of how to put it to its best use, and that's all there is to it. And there's just a social question of how to resolve that conflict. Or, normatively, you're right and he's wrong. Right? Or at least that's possible. Maybe you're not 100% sure, but you think you're right, and you think there is such a thing to be right. He might think he's right, but one of you is in fact right, and one of you is in fact wrong.
Well, that is a great. Well, I think I'm right, of course. Right.
You think you're really right, yeah.
But
right.
I don't.
Okay.
But I don't really think I'm right. I mean, part of what I'm trying to do in this book is illustrate. I mean, these conflicts exist all over, and we understand them. The distinction between landscapes there for our recreational use or aesthetic enjoyment, and landscapes that are put to work for different productive uses. But my sense is that, just to carry that forward, that tension is always there. And I don't think it's resolvable in terms of, good, always protect, bad, never develop or exploit, as the word is sometimes used, because human beings are users of nature. We evolved that way. That's the way we got to where we are today, and the way we can continue, with the level of comfort and longevity that we have. So it's always a balance. I don't think there's one good side or bad side, but I think, in a way, it's just part of my project is just to explore in a way that I think is more place-based, more specific, that particular divide. And maybe, I guess this would be my normative thumb on the scale, maybe develop in a more persuasive way the sense of the importance or value of natural landscapes for human flourishing. Because I think that's something that's easy to put aside in the drive to maximize sort of the productivity of land and resources. And it's something that I think is worth constantly bringing to the fore and showing again the importance of.
And so that, just to put a fine point on it, that sounds like a claim, at least partially, about a mistake, that if we were to fail to appropriately, or people who fail to appropriately value the role of natural landscapes and human flourishing, are making a mistake. That it's not simply a preference, simply different ways of looking at the world, but at least as human beings are currently culturally and biologically oriented, that there is a better and worse way of thinking about at least this question. Not to mean that it's a be all end all and that there shouldn't be no such thing as development and the like, but there are better and worse ways of approaching these questions, in part, if you're informed by this better way of thinking about landscapes. And maybe just to add something to that is, if someone were to only value natural landscapes and to disregard altogether direct human needs, say didn't care if people starved to death, that would be a mistake too.
That would be a mistake too. I guess what I'm urging, probably implicitly, is that people adopt an open and deliberative approach to these issues in a way that allows them to the extent that any individual can, to integrate these different dimensions, but also in the process of that, making sure they give full expression to those different dimensions and don't artificially diminish or minimize them.
So here's another related question, and maybe we can move tacks a little bit from this. It's funny because the point of your project is to ground us in particular places, and then all I want to do is take us to the most abstract way of talking about this.
And that's part of what I'm pushing back against that.
Right. But just to do one more very abstract question, I'm wondering if the sensibility that you're describing here is ethical or if it's aesthetic. In the way that, on the one hand, if someone were to come along and say, look, I just don't care if other people starve to death, that would be I would certainly think that would be an ethical mistake on their part. They would be making a huge moral error. Right. On the other hand, if someone were to say, look, I just don't care about natural landscapes. I like cities. I like, when I look out at the world, if I see undeveloped land, I want to, let's put a mall there. Let's put a strip mine there. Is that a moral mistake, or are they making an aesthetic mistake? The same way that if someone were to look at some, hand drawing that I made and say, oh, that's actually, kind of better art than Picasso's Guernica, right? They would be making a severely mistaken aesthetic judgment. How would you classify this what you're describing?
Well, I'm not sure, and I know there's a lot of moral philosophy about this, or I'm guessing there is.
There's a lot of moral philosophy about everything, right?
Yeah, that's right. But I'm not sure there is a firm distinction between aesthetics and ethical judgments. We talk about or at least people used to talk about the the true, the good, and the beautiful. And I think there is something innate in us that encourages us to connect what we think is beautiful with what we think is good. But that doesn't solve the problem, of course, because people think different things are beautiful.
Right.
And I think our notions of beauty evolve over time, depending on our experiences. But you're exactly right. I mean, there are developers who have talked to who say, they see open land as waste.
Right. Probably a good chunk of human history looked at,
Right.
I mean, open land was dangerous.
Right. It was waste, and it was not pretty. It was something to be transformed into settlements or development that was useful to human beings, and those were beautiful. Cities are beautiful, and I actually think cities are beautiful too in their own ways. So I guess I'm avoiding your question. I'm not sure that there's a strong distinction, but there probably is more of a distinction than I'm willing or able to articulate.
So to maybe get us back to a somewhat more concrete set of cases, part of what I think is an interesting tension in the contemporary environmental movement is exactly on this thing that we're talking about, which is what I might call the old school view about natural landscapes, which I think is probably closer to what you're articulating.
Right.
And how that's somewhat in tension, or actually often in extreme tension, with the need to devote substantial parts of the landscape to renewable energy development if we're going to address climate change. And putting wind turbines on mountaintops, freeing up large swaths of offshore areas for wind turbines. And then, even more land intensive is solar, going out to the Mojave Desert and carpeting it with solar panels. What do you think of this tension in the contemporary environmental movement? Is it just a matter of kind of striking the right balance? I mean, that's I think that's a lot of people would agree with that very generally. But do you think it undermines some of the moral force of the environmental movement when they have to be advocating both things simultaneously for the natural landscape and for very intensive development?
Right. So that's a great question, and I think it's a real problem for at least traditional environmentalists. And I start by saying something obvious, that is place exists at different scales, right? So we have our home place, our place of most immediate experience, but there are also places that we define and think of and relate to at larger scales, like regions and states and nations, and I would say also the planet. Obviously, our relationship to the planet is more attenuated or abstract than our relation to our home place, but I think it's nonetheless an important one, and it's informed by more and more information that we have. I mean, maybe not so much direct experience, but information that we get in from studies and newspaper accounts and everything that we can go on the World Wide Web and find out in a second. And that connection to the planet means that we have concerns, or might mean that we have concerns about the health of the planet as a whole, and not just our particular environment. And I think that's where I see the tension getting resolved. I have solar panels on our property, sufficient to provide us with our electrical needs over the year, and I think they're beautiful. And part of the reason I think they're beautiful and good is that I'm relating them to a larger planetary need. If I were just thinking of my own place, I'm not sure that I would think that they were beautiful. Mm-hmm. But the perspective, the shift in scales, allows me to say those are great, and we ought to have more of them. And I could say the same about transmission lines and wind farms. And I think actually wind turbines are beautiful, particularly if they're understood in this larger concept of a planetary need, kind of an evolution of the landscape to accommodate a larger concern.
Of course, I want to just be a pain and say, so kind of in the same vein, someone could look at a coal-fired power plant or a chemical factory or an arms factory, for that matter, and say, these are beautiful because they're in service of human development, or the war against fascism, if it was, in the in the 40s, or the war, the effort to push back totalitarian and communism. And so, so that context, that kind of broader socio-political global context, world historical context, could make lots of different kinds of things appear beautiful in different observers' eyes.
I think that's correct. And I think that goes back to our conversation earlier about the developer seeing, a new shopping center being beautiful. And perhaps that suggests that mere aesthetics by itself doesn't serve the moral or normative function that I'm suggesting for it. You have to go deeper. And I think there's, our views about these things are determined or conditioned significantly on our worldviews and what we think at sort of the foundational level is important for human and non-human flourishing.
Yeah, so just to maybe get to your own experiences, this is a fascinating, and this seems like part of your project, is this interplay between the direct sensory experiences that we have of the world,
right?
Which we can think of as just like this raw, the raw input, photons hitting our eyeballs and that kind of thing, which our brains actually, do an enormous amount of pre-processing before sending upstream to like the kind of cognitive centers where we could, even conceive of aesthetic appreciation, ethical normative reasoning happening. So that's pretty structured just probably by our physiology. But then there's, any case, we've got those cognitive, ethical, aesthetic judgments being made or somehow from the sensory experience that presumably, I think part of what you're talking about, that those set of sensory experiences and how we relate to our direct physical, immediate context, place, then informs the bigger picture worldview kind of, way that we put the world together, which then feeds back into our sensory, feeds back into our sensory perception, or the way we interpret our sensory perception. That's the, two people look at a mall and they feel it very differently based on their worldviews, but then that worldview came from somewhere. And I think part of your argument is that worldview comes in part from our sensory experience and how we relate to place. So that's an interesting model. I wonder if we could put it to use a little bit to describe your own experiences. Like, what are some of the ways that you've seen this? Have you seen this feedback happen in your own history, where places feed into a worldview that feeds back into how you interpret places? Is that a way of thinking that has any resonance for you?
Yes, I think that's true, at least in my experience. I mean, I sort of think about my childhood with a very immediate. I grew up in Florida, which is a very different environment than the one I inhabit now. But that was a time. Childhood is a time of a sort of immediate contact with the environment, and I spent a lot of time outdoors. and developed a sense of comfort, I think, which some people don't have, a sense of comfort being outdoors in a natural environment or a semi-natural environment. And that dimension of my early experience continued to develop with opportunities to go out west, for example, to work with my uncle on a horse farm during my teen years, or camping trips that I took with an uncle to whom I was very close, and so forth. And that sort of became a dimension of my outlook, and the pleasure of those trips, the significance of them in my developmental arc, was sort of defining in a sense. And maybe that's unique to me, or maybe it's a function of opportunities I had or that other people didn't have, or maybe it's something entirely different. Maybe it's in the DNA. I don't know. I can't explain it, but I experienced the evolution of that. And that in turn has led me to make certain choices. I went to D.C. to be an environmental lawyer and make a career, but as soon as I'd sort of done that, I escaped to the Virginia Piedmont because I wanted to be here. I mean, this is the place that I wanted to be physically and sort of aesthetically. And so my choice is reinforced. I see the things that I want to see now. I see the things that I think are beautiful, and the opportunities to move in a landscape that I value. So I guess you could see all that as a kind of a circle that reinforces certain early tendencies and brings them to completion toward the end of life.
Again, many different ways to take the conversation here.
That's a big load.
Right. Part of what I think is kind of fun about the experiences you've shared is I relate to those, the being a kid and being outside, kind of in what I think of as a semi-disturbed, suburban landscape where, right. At least that's where I grew up in upstate New York, and it sounds a little bit like where you grew up in Florida,
exactly. Right?
Where there's rows of houses, and my father built our house on an acre of land, that we cleared. I'm talking about clearing land, actually, and but within a 5-minute bike ride, there was woods and streams and all that places you can go camping and all that. And I spent an enormous amount of time like that. And one kind of branch of the conversation is I wonder to what extent the contemporary environmental movement is just made up of kids who like to play outside when they were little, and that ends up being very formative. And then and that's just kind of interesting, perhaps, that there's some experiences that a lot of people have shared, which are different from folks who live in really intensely developed urban environments or very, very rural places where there is a different way of relating to the landscape, right, in terms of productivity and agriculture and the like. So that's kind of one thread that I think is potentially interesting, is just how a certain kind of experience can play out and feed into almost a political debate. But the other one I was, the other almost challenge that I wanted to raise a little bit more of it being a pain is, it kind of this idea of nostalgia, right? And maybe these things are related, that, there are certain experiences that we have as kids and we relate to the world in a particular way, and we spend like a huge part of our lives trying to get that back. It's this kind of subconscious process. And part of people engaging in environmental advocacy or, going to certain types of landscapes, valuing certain types of vistas and the like, is really a kind of psychological thing of recapturing a lost youth.
Yeah. So that's great. I love that. So kids that want to play outside become environmentalists.
Right.
Kids that don't want to or don't find much pleasure in it because they get stung by insects or
Right.
prickled by brambles,
Right.
become developers. I don't know. That could be. And maybe we're all predisposed one way or the other. I mean, certain of us don't care so much about being bitten by insects. And, we go on and spend our lives longing for the woods. I think there is a nostalgia element, perhaps, in this. There's a poem from Wordsworth, and I can't remember it exactly, but he laments in middle age. He laments the lost connection with nature. There's passed away a glory from the earth, is the line I remember, which is, and the glory is this sort of immediate, intuitive connection to nature, which becomes less accessible to him, at least intuitively, as he gets older. And I think, at least those who have the experience or think they've had the experience of that as kids, feel that to some extent. You get older, you have more sort of intellectual approach to things, you're more rational, and there's this sense of loss. But I think, and this may be deeper than anyone wants to go, but I think there is a current and available connection to nature and natural landscapes in later life. And people describe it differently as cosmic joy, or some sort of recognition of the universal, or you can put it in religious terms. But I think that's available to people who are open to it and have the capacity for it, and that's a very important component of life, or at least in those lives where it occurs. And I think, in a way, that I think to emphasize that sort of risks making environmentalists kind of elitists, or the protectors or purveyors of a rather specialized human experience. But I don't know how rare that experience is, but it's one that I seek even when I don't find it, and get immense pleasure from when I do find it and it's there.
Yeah, I mean, my impression is that people, like almost everybody, is looking for something along the lines that you're describing. I mean, whether it's, and they look for it in a church, or in, lots of different ways. One question, kind of I think I keep returning to in a way on this, is how much of this is tied to the kind of quote unquote nature, the trees, forests, and undisturbed nature, places that look, comport with a certain idea of what a landscape looks like without human intervention, and you've got various shades of from that ideal on through to a city. And I think of some experiences that I had. So I used to live in New York before I came to New York City. Before I came to Charlottesville, I grew up in upstate New York, and I lived in the Brooklyn and Manhattan for a number of years. And I used to get around the city on a bike, and I had some experiences I still very fondly remember of late at night when the streets aren't full of traffic, riding around in Manhattan and Brooklyn, and that's awesome. It's an awesome experience, and I've been on mountaintops, and I've been in forested landscape, and those are awesome too. But one's at least in my experience, they're kind of they're very different from each other, but one's not clearly more deeper or or broader. So even though they're both in places, of course, well, because you can't get away from that. But so I do wonder about this. How much of what we're talking about is tied into this, the undisturbed landscape kind of thing.
Yeah, so I think I think that's a really good point. I think the undisturbed landscape is one venue for this, but it's not the only venue. It can't be the only venue. And of course, when we're talking about undisturbed landscapes, I'm talking about the woods near my house.
Which those are totally disturbed.
Those woods grew up on land that was totally disturbed by the early, colonial settlers who basically ripped all the trees off the land so that they could farm it. So there's actually more trees now.
Yep.
There than there were, 150 years ago.
Oh, certainly, yeah.
And they're not the same, it's not an old-growth forest. It's just a place with some trees.
Right. Some 60-year-old trees.
Probably some invasive species.
Yep. Almost certainly.
August olive taking over all the, So it's not, but there is a kind of an otherness to it that I think gives rise to a different state of mind than we experience in more closely packed or populated environments. But I think that even that's going too far, because you can experience cosmic joy in New York City.
They sell it in various corners.
That's right, exactly. I don't know, Walt Whitman crossing the Staten Island Ferry or something. Yeah. That's a very connected, joyful poem. And I think experience with people can directly with people can produce that same sort of thing. So I think there's a risk, and you point this out, of sort of valorizing these particular landscapes as the ultimate source of these kind of deep connections. It's much more complicated than that.
Yeah,
but they are one source.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, so to get into the complications a little bit, you mentioned the kind of settlers, and of course, we're talking about European settlers, and the places that we live in are often very complex in that way. They have complex histories, complex political histories, complex histories with respect to justice and injustice, and maybe as a way to get into that conversation, even the idea of an undisturbed landscape that has such resonance in the U.S. environmental movement and U.S. culture more generally, I think it's probably fair to say that comes out of a particular European, way of relating to a landscape that had been depopulated through disease and war and expropriation.
Right.
And then, once the current indigenous people, the indigenous, very substantial population of indigenous folks and who were using the landscape in lots of ways for their own purposes, were pushed off or killed. And then people said, "Wow, isn't this beautiful here?"
That's right,
and that becomes a kind of idealized Eden. So that's troubling. And when we're thinking about our own experiences with these beautiful landscapes and they're meaningful to us, there is this background of injustice and suffering that exists on every landscape in many different layers, especially in the Americas, but that exists everywhere in the world. There's a history to every landscape. So how do we make sense of that? We experience a place now viscerally, but part of the abstraction that comes with any place, one abstraction is to locate that physical sensorium within a planetary context,
right?
In a big three-dimensional space. But another way of providing context to that sensorium is in four-dimensional space, and we can take a spot and we can trace backwards in time, and a lot of times that context is troubling and complicated. And how do we make sense of that?
Yeah, so that's a great question too. I mean, and none of these landscapes is uncomplicated, as you say. I mean, the land that I live on now was once a plantation. It's much smaller now than it was in pre-Civil War times, but it has a house that was built before the Civil War, and after we moved in, we found an inventory that showed the names of enslaved people, which we must have known had been there, but when we saw the inventory, it kind of hit us with a ton of force that, in fact, that land had been the land on which people were held captive and forced to work.
Yeah.
And we've spent a lot of time since then learning who those people were and tracing their descendants and trying to reconcile the history to the place. But I'm not sure that either my wife or I believe that a reconciliation is ultimately possible, and that's just part of the history of the land, an ugly and brutal part of the history of the land that will always be there for anyone who takes any time to understand the land and its history. And of course, as you talk about, there's the earlier displacement of the Monacan Indians who were there and whose artifacts we find on the land, arrowheads and axe heads and so forth. They occupied that land, made their living off the land, and then we took it. And we own the land that was theirs. So there's that forced labor and dispossession that are part of the history and part of an understanding of the place overall. And I think they qualify this, the more exhilarating, they deeply qualify the more exhilarating dimensions of the experience. But they're all part of it.
Yeah. So on this, the qualification part of it, I'm just trying to think about how to even, relate to this question of, is it qualification, right? I guess is the question, because, it's like, is it an asterisk?
Yeah.
Like, oh, this is beautiful, asterisk. Oh yeah, I was expropriated and, enslaved people work here and, so on and so forth. And it's something that we should all keep in mind. Let's go back and, let's, okay, now we've read the footnote, we can go back to appreciating the landscape.
Yeah.
Or is it something else where it's entangled with the beauty of the landscape in such a way that it doesn't even make sense to think of the landscape as beautiful or as anything outside of this context? I guess I don't know if it's fully satisfying. The asterisk version, I'm not sure is fully satisfying, but I'm not sure that I have anything better to add as an alternative.
I totally agree with you, and I haven't yet in my own mind come fully to terms with how to integrate that information into the overall sense of the place. My wife has done a lot of work and to develop that information. So we know a lot about the people who were there now, more than people believed was possible when we started out. And we are in communication with the people who are their descendants and have active discussions with them about the meaning of the place for them and what they think we should think about the place in light of that history. So it's an ongoing discussion that is very important to us in terms of living there, but I don't have an ultimate resolution. And maybe that the land is just permanently cursed by that history. And I'm not even sure what I mean when I say that, but it may be a mark that can never be. Well, it's a mark that never will be eradicated, but it may be a mark that remains toxic. There's no way to detoxify it.
Yeah, I mean that's a pretty that's obviously a pessimistic, and maybe that doesn't mean it's wrong way, but
Right.
on the other hand, because you guys found this ledger and it had such an impact on you, and because you treated it seriously and engaged with the history in a respectful way, you built a lot of relationships with people who you wouldn't otherwise have had any relationship with. And, just obvious, human value that comes out of that.
Well, it's human value to us, and I think it's human value to the people, to the folks that we're involved with. But it's fraught also, right? I mean, we're living in a house. We're living in a house that was the center of an oppressive regime for their forebears.
Right. And clearly, if you could go back in time, you would, and these are bad things that happened,
Right.
And we're not, and obviously you're not celebrating them. You're acknowledging the reality that they happened, and it's just the question. Really, the only question that we have now is how do we relate to these events that we can't do anything about them in the past, other than to. But there are things that we could do differently today based on our understanding of those past events. I mean, one, I'm curious if this is a fair characterization is, we've kind of started the conversation with this aesthetic versus moral kind of question about how to relate to landscapes, and different people have different ways of relating to landscapes. And, maybe it's just, it's just a preference that doesn't need to be justified. Maybe there are judgments, either ethical or aesthetic, that are made that could be subject to, kind of reasoned deliberation. And I think here we're talking about a different way of relating to the landscape. Do we owe an obligation to engage with these histories? Is that a better way of relating to a landscape, either aesthetically or morally, than someone who comes along and says, "Hey, you know what? Let's just forget about that.
Yeah.
Let's knock the old house down. We'll build a new one, and we won't worry about what this land was used for."
Exactly right. Well, I guess that's a stark way of putting the question, but I think it's an important one. And these, and this is not just history. We had the experience of having one of the descendants of enslaved people at our house staying with us when the white supremacists came to town.
Okay,
that's
crazy.
Just incidental,
yeah.
Right? And so these. This history extends, like all histories, into the present in hurtful and threatening ways. So I think, in a way, coming to accommodation with history is coming to an accommodation with the present.
So last couple of questions for you. I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today, John.
This is fun. Yeah.
It relates to this kind of current political dilemma that we have around environmental issues. And again, at the beginning of the conversation, I quoted that Ruckelshaus piece about the lost consensus on the environment. And so, on the one hand, there is a way in which place is a human universal. We all relate to a place. We all care about physical places, and that's a way of bridging perhaps difference and political disagreement and so on. We can say, look, let's look at this shared foundation that we have as people located in places. And that sounds promising as a way to maybe build political coalitions and rebuild political consensus around, making progress on environmental issues. But on the other hand, where the conversation ends is a very complex landscape of highly contested historical interpretation and difference and painful histories that many people would like to pretend just didn't happen, and that doesn't seem like a fruitful ground for building political compromise at all. Right. And so I guess the final question for you is what role does this idea of place and different ways of relating to place and so on, does it have in informing a path forward on politics or maybe environmental politics or maybe not at all?
Well, that's a good final question, and I don't have a very good answer to it. I think the contestation that we've sort of identified in place means that it's often just as hard to resolve questions at the local level as it is at the national or international level. Mm-hmm. But I think the fact of greater shared experience at the local level makes it easier in some ways to overcome differences in interests and worldviews. The shared experience is significant. If you know somebody or you know somebody who knows somebody, often that connection helps. Or at least it minimizes the viciousness of the conflict. Mm-hmm. But I don't know that builds to a sort of a more general model of conflict resolution at higher scales, right? Mm-hmm. I don't know that if you can resolve a land use issue at the local level, does that say anything about your ability to deal with climate change policy at the national level or the international level? And for those issues, the resolution really has to occur at the higher scales. Okay. The only other point I would make is that it may be at the local scale where people are experiencing, for example, effects of climate change and sharing those experiences with their neighbors. There is some ability to build in a sort of bottoms-up way some national consensus, but I have no real evidence for that.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought though, and it's worth exploring. One of the things I always appreciate about you, John, is that you don't overclaim. Which is a very a scarce commodity of non-overclaiming in the world of environmental politics and legal scholarship. So I always value that. Well, thanks so much for the conversation today. It was super interesting and always a pleasure to chat with you.
Thanks, Mike. I really appreciated it, and I hope it was useful. I feel much better. Thank you.